Welcome, everyone, to this conversation with artist Shikeith. I'm Chris Boot. I'm an independent photography producer and editor, and it's an honor and a pleasure to host this meeting today with multidisciplinary artist and photographer Shikeith as part of Photo London's events program. I was first aware of your work, Shikeith, when it was chosen by curators Antoine Sargent and Brendan Emser, among others, for Aperture's Summer Open Group Show in 2018. What was included in the show was a really rather extraordinary video installation, a darkened room with images projected on all four walls, and if I remember correctly, the floor too. They weren't photographs, but powerful, disturbing, transgressive, hedonist, spiritual, violent at moments, video images, very beautiful too, and very striking in relation to each other. I didn't know how to piece it all together at the time, though I now know it deployed many of the themes and concerns that characterize your work more broadly. I was also working at Aperture when we decided to publish your first book of photographs, now about to come out, though we never met. So when Photo London asked if there was someone I would like to be in conversation with, my first thoughts, especially as I'd not got the chance to meet you before, was you. So thank you, Shikeith, for agreeing to participate. You're going to tell us a little bit about the evolution of your work, in particular your photography. But first, a brief introduction. Shikeith, you were born in 1989 in Philadelphia and now live in Pittsburgh, which is where you're speaking from now. Is that right? If you're on this, maybe I can't tell what you've gone quiet, but let me finish this and I'm going to introduce you in a second. I'm going to hand over to you in a second. You received your MFA in sculpture from the Yale School of Art after earning a BA in Integrative, I don't even know how to pronounce it, Integrative Arts from Pennsylvania State. Your work, is that right?
Yes, that is.
Your work, as you put it on the bio on your website, investigates the experience of Black men within and around concepts of psychic space. You've had solo shows at the Alexander Brest Museum Gallery in Jacksonville, Locust Projects in Miami, Atlanta Contemporary, and the Mattress Factory Museum of Contemporary Art in Pittsburgh. Your many awards and grants include a Painters and Sculptors Grant from the Joan Mitchell Foundation, an Art Matters Foundation grant, and an Artist Fellowship at the Lohman Museum, New York. Your photographs are represented by Yossi Milo Gallery in New York. A few procedural notes before we start. After Shikeith has introduced his work, I'll continue the conversation a bit and then we'll open to questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A box to put your questions. We're aiming for about 45 minutes in total. Shikeith, you're going to talk for about 20, so I'll give you a heads up when we're nearing that point. The conversation is being recorded, as was mentioned, and will be available after the event on Photo London's Facebook page. Also, I mentioned that Aperture is publishing Shikeith's first photography. It's called Notes Towards Becoming a Spill. It isn't out for a couple of months yet, but pre-orders can be placed now on the Aperture website. And you can find out more about it, and I believe a forthcoming limited edition print if you drop by the Aperture booth at Photo London. Thank you, Photo London, for making this happen, to all of you watching, and thank you, Shikeith. Over to you. From Pittsburgh, is that right?
Pittsburgh, from Pittsburgh.
Excellent.
Yes, Pittsburgh is a great city. I've been here since 2018, following graduating from Yale with my MFA. I call Pittsburgh my Cinderella story. So it's just been a really wonderful time being an artist here. Thank you for having me, Photo London. Obviously, I've never been to London, and hopefully I can come over after this. And Chris, I'm sad we never met in person, but I'm glad we get to do this today. So I guess we can start the presentation. All right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so what you're looking at on your screen is me. I am 3 years old here. I'm at my grandmother's house where I spent a lot of time as a child um, around her. And it's, as you can see, I'm holding some Kodak film in my hand. And which is pretty cool, to have that kind of photograph, but it's just an indication of the space that I grew up in. My grandmother, she was someone who we probably wouldn't call a professional photographer, but photography was a big thing for her. I grew up in a house with portraits of my family that date back to the 1800s, all the way around, covering all of the walls, an assortment of magazines stacked piled high that I would play with endlessly at the dining table right behind me in this picture. And so images have played a huge role in my upbringing and a lot of what I was attracted to growing up. And very early on, I decided that I wanted to be an artist. In kindergarten, I had my first exhibition actually at the Philadelphia Art Museum, where I was chosen because I had won a competition of kindergarten artists, which was really cool to have that. And I should probably put that on my resume actually as my first exhibition. But the legacy of photography in my family was something that was super personal, and it inspired me to just being around her, and her images inspired me to do what I do today. And so I kind of wanted to begin there as an introduction to understand the sort of importance and urgency around the medium in relation to me. Could we go to the next slide? Thank you. I usually don't start here, but I decided for this presentation to start in 2012. I began my undergraduate career at Penn State University in 2006. And at the time, I went in wanting to study photography because I was deeply influenced by fashion photography that was sparked by watching the show America's Next Top Model with Tyra Banks. And for my high school senior project, I did an entire sort of almost a parody of the show, where I made these fashion photographs in and around the city of Philadelphia with my fellow students, and just really drawn to the medium and wanting to pursue it further. So in my entire time during my my undergraduate education, I made photographs endlessly, studied photography with professors, and but the thing was, I was only creating fashion images, and mostly fashion images that included primarily women. At the time, I really wasn't comfortable with the idea of making anything that was personal. I was still sort of struggling with my identity, growing up in Philadelphia, which is a pretty hard place to grow up in. It's pretty tough, but it's also a place where, the imagination thrives depending on your socioeconomic status. And but I while in undergrad, I did not really want to pursue or think about making photographs that were personal, but more so surface level, really just fashion imagery that were pretty good for what the resources that I had at that time. And so I went on to do internships at places like Teen Vogue, worked in spaces with photographers like Patrick Demarchier, Stephen Meisel, under the IMG World internship. And so I was always around these people and really inspired by the medium and going forward with the medium as a career. But it wasn't until 2012 that I decided that I really wanted to start to make personal work that was about my experiences. And I didn't really have the language for it. During my education, I kind of tapped out when it came to like learning a lot about contemporary art, because I was so dead set on this career in fashion. So I kind of missed the boat then. And I had to kind of pick up a lot of the information I learned about art history through sites like Tumblr, which is a very a new thing. But in 2012, we'd also have so many different things happening socially in the country that were just starting to get off the ground. But right before then, I decided that I did want to start talking about my life, my experiences, because, you know, I felt like art could be that sort of cathartic medium for me, and sort of transforming and healing myself from a lot of the things that I had gone through because of my identity growing up. And so I set out and made this single image of one of my friends, and looking at it, you know, now I see some of the motifs that will pop back up later on in the work. Um, and so we can go forward. Thank you. So in 2013, I made this photograph entitled Dreams in Black and White. And it is set against the Philadelphia skyline. And you see two figures, shadowy figures, holding balloons, sort of leaping statically across this roof. And this photograph was the first time that I decided to take a look at my dreams and nightmares that I was having pertaining my identity. Growing up, as I mentioned, it was pretty rough in Philadelphia, and I was bullied relentlessly because of what people thought or people assumed of my sexuality before I even like had the language or understanding of what was going on. And it led to a deep depression very young. And that depression continued into my young adult years. And so, again, just wanting to think about how I could use art to transform my experiences, transform my life, and not even thinking about an art career or anything like that. I made this photograph, which was a reproduction of a dream or a nightmare that I would have, where I would be standing on a roof, and every single person, bully, whatever you have it, would be chasing after me. And the only way for me to escape them would be this balloon that I would see on the edge of the roof. And in every dream that I would have, I would go and try to grab this balloon, but ultimately I would fall to my death or just wake up before anything could happen. And so when I set out to make this image, I wanted to sort of revision that dream in a way that I saw myself flying away safely. We can move forward. The balloon became a huge part of how I conflated different ideas of safety and desire, and just a liveliness later on in the work. So as you can see here in this photograph in 2016, which skips a few years forward, I'm using the balloon again to represent these different ideas that I had sort of mining around about becoming, you know, and settling into my identity and my queerness. And the photographs continue to sort of be these gray images. And I chose gray because not just for like the sort of moodiness that people might sort of attach to a black and white image, but thinking about gray as this sort of in-between space, in between both black and white. And that's sort of how I felt. And again, really just not knowing about an art career or exhibiting in a gallery, just sort of making these photographs for myself to heal some of these psychic wounds, as I call them, that I had experienced growing up. And we can move forward a little bit. And so you see how I sort of brought the balloon out of the 2D into the 3D here, while also acknowledging breath and other sort of ephemeral ideas like promise. And I decided to take the balloon and make it out of glass, because I think glass embodies a sort of queerness in itself, where it evades a sort of state of being that is one way or another. When people think about glass, it can be both a liquid, it could be a solid, it could be gaseous. It can exist in all of these different ways, which to me feels very queer. It feels like um, you're existing in a way that isn't fixed. And I wanted to take that up with working with glass, and then imagining this balloon that had become a repeated motif in my work in the 3D at this point. You can go to the next slide. So I'll go back to 2013. Following the time that I had made those images on the roof, I was more so trying to connect to my personal experiences with my identity, of course, and growing up as a young Black queer boy in Philadelphia, and really tapping into my unconscious or subconscious, rather, thoughts and dreams. And, you know, at the time, things were really starting to sort of pick up when it came to the Black Lives Matter movement following the death of Trayvon Martin and the protests in and around the country. And so I kind of got swept up in a lot of that, because, you know, the question of Black men and our humanity was at the forefront of the news. In which, you know, photography in itself has this long history of dehumanizing Black people, and I wanted to use the camera at this point to almost kind of like repel some of those past actions in which the meeting was used to in a quite destructive manner. And I created this image. Well, I had the idea for this image where I will invite a group of Black men who were strangers for the first time into the studio space that I was using, that belonged to an older photographer who sort of took me in as a sort of mentee. And I wanted to start inviting people in from Philadelphia, these men from Philadelphia, to make these photographs where they would cry. And I hadn't really thought too much ahead, and like, how am I going to make these people cry for these photographs? And I kind of had to learn as I went along with it, the way that I would interact with people who would sit for me. And you know, before, like I said before, then it had always sort of been just like school friends and neighborhood friends, but never really this sort of like intent on creating these images with a social narrative, until I got to this point, because of what the unrest that was happening in and around the world related to Black lives. And so where trouble melts like lemon drops, I invited this young man into the studio that I was using, and I found online this chemical that would spark tears. And I explained to him, you know, I wanted to create these images that showcase Black men expressing sides of their emotions that rarely get showcased, whether this is sort of like nationally or like within our communities itself. And so we use this chemical to spark tears. And unfortunately, I don't know what it was. And I assume it was because of the sort of the restraint around emotion that gets sort of ingrained into a lot of young Black men, that not even the chemical agent could you know, spark these tears that I so desperately wanted to create for this series of images. And kind of in a panic, but a good panic, I decided that maybe I should start talking to him and just start sharing some of the things that I had been through, and hearing some of the things that he had been through, almost like a sort of therapy session, where our transaction became less about just me setting out to make these photographs and have something produced, but something that was more significant. It was about community building and leaning on one another. And in the midst of us sort of expressing some of the things and trials and tribulations that we had been through, he began to cry. And then that's when I produced these images. And so we can go to the next video. I'll just pause really quick before you play. I continue to think about these ideas, these transactions between young Black men, particularly Black queer men, and how we could expand what had just taken place in my studio. And I came up with the hashtag Black Men Dream. Again, thinking about those first earlier images where the dream and the nightmare and how I sort of was starting to heal myself through sort of like investigating those things, those thoughts, and wanting to sort of extend that to a host of strangers or close friends or friends that I kind of knew but didn't really have a relationship where we talked about things that were deeply personal. And so at the time, hashtags were really big in 2014. And so again, off of the rush of Black Lives Matter. And so I wanted to use a hashtag, or rather create a hashtag in which young Black men or whoever would engage with this video could use it to see one another responding to the questions posed in this film. And so I'm going to share a sample really quickly of this film documentary from 2014.
To become a man?
I think I became an honest man, which I think is the more important part. In June 2005, when I admitted out loud to people I cared about that I was gay. And in that moment, I think I was finally owning who I was supposed to be. I think I got exposed to a lot of things early as a child, so that aged me in a way. But I think if you're not operating from the space where you're being yourself completely and totally, you're not whole. So for me, that was that moment where, okay, now I am a man.
Technically, I became a man when I left the house at 18. Figuratively, when I was able to fully take care of myself. How would you describe your interaction with other Black males in your youth?
Other Black males my age don't understand me, and I try my best to coax egos, and it doesn't really work out too well. So I kind of avoid them, to be honest.
I got picked on. I was always the Black boy that sounds white or talks white. So not great.
I shrunk a lot. I was already a very short kid, but I was never one that liked sports or even hip hop or anything like that. So in my neighborhood, I got along with most of the other Black boys. I had two older brothers, and my father was around. So I had a lot of Black men present in my life, but I think that I was always trying to hide certain parts of myself to try to gain their acceptance. And I didn't necessarily participate in what they like to do, but I definitely hid what I liked that they didn't necessarily find acceptable.
Interacting with Black kids here, or Black youth, wasn't the best. I spent a lot of time in the library by myself reading, because I just didn't fit in. And I tried to fit in, changed up my whole wardrobe, wearing baggy clothes and stuff, but it didn't really work, so.
Very conflicting. I think just just from the onslaught, my father, we have a complicated relationship because he is someone who was abused by his father, and he's an alcoholic, so he was verbally and sometimes physically abusive towards my mother.
And to become a man.
So just to quickly just go over the film, which you can view on the Criterion currently. The reason why I decided to again shoot this film in gray is because of this sort of in-between space. But the idea of rendering the backs to the camera was to emphasize listening, listening to a community of people who rarely get that opportunity to be heard. And so we can move forward.
Shikeith, we're actually at about the 20-minute mark. I think this is so interesting. I think you should take as long as you need, but just to bear in mind that we're already there.
Okay, so we can just pass through some images now from that I took during my years at Yale, just sort of thinking about desire and love and whatnot. But here is one image in particular that started off the aesthetic of sweat and perspiration that you'll see in this new body of work, and the ideas around it, that swirl. So we can fast forward some more. There's the work that Chris loves so much. And you can keep going. These are just a whirlwind of images that happened while I was, we can stop here, while I was trying to get to this point, which, you know, took a lot of time. So here you see this image entitled Chris that I started in 2019, made in 2019 in Jacksonville, Florida. And this begins this sort of project where I'm thinking about how I could talk about Black interior space through other sort of formal or aesthetic choices. So we have Chris pictured inside of this sort of Black box, and the lighting began a sort of investigation of spirituality as well, because I'm referencing a lot of religious painting, particularly the religious painting, The Annunciation by Henry, what's his last name? I forgot, but it's a really famous painting that hangs in the Philadelphia Art Museum, The Annunciation. And so the warmth of the images are just me, again, trying to sort of map onto the religious ecstatic, but then also the ecstatic that occurs whether you're like on a dance floor. And so we can move forward to the next image. And this particular image entitled Prince was made in Jacksonville, Florida as well. And it was the second work that I had made. And again, you're starting to see a shift in how I'm portraying queerness, how I'm portraying Black men, from these sort of discretionary aesthetics of the past where you would see people in shadows, to these sort of more, these images sort of existing with a host of bravado that sort of goes unjustified. It's in your face. And that was something that I really wanted to work towards. And so we can continue on. Another sort of thing that's interesting about this new body of work is the intergenerational selection of subjects. Here we have Hunter, who was a retired military veteran and also a stripper. And I photographed him in his early 60s here. And again, just trying to showcase different depictions of queerness and how they exist outside of what we're used to within traditional gay portraiture, where there's an emphasis on the youthful body. And I wanted to try to evade those choices. And same with the next image, I believe. It's the idea of showcasing a variation of body types within these sort of discussions around the psychic experiences, because obviously with Black men in particular, body size comes with a new there's a heightened public imagining around different kinds of body types within Black men. And so it's very important for me in my practice, even though I'm not someone who's like representations matters or whatever, but just wanted to showcase a range of body types. We can keep going through this new body of work that sort of just is a range of things that pull from my imaginings around the archive. So for instance, I collect a lot of archival photographs in my work. I've been trying to bring them in along with the objects to imagine or fabulate around the lives of these people. Go forward. Again, blue is a huge part of my vernacular as an artist. And here we have blue coming in as a figure of desire that's offering intimacy to this person, this subject rather. And again, the sort of sweat being this sort of evidence of desire raising to the surface of the flesh across this series of images as well. We'll continue forward. And we'll just kind of just flash through. A lot of the times with these images, I'm thinking about how I can bring in motifs that relate back to my experiences growing up in a Christian household, and how I can sort of reimagine those visions through these sort of alchemies, an alchemy of choices to whether I'm bringing in symbols of baptism or conjuring. I try to keep those things alive, in particular the color blue, and how that exists as a spiritual marker in my work, whether it's the fine artwork or, as we see here, the commercial work. It's about trying to sort of keep these sort of lineages alive, and we can keep going.
To interrupt there, with Lil Nas, did you get to choose the colors? There was, because I would have assumed that with photographing a subject like that, you've got relatively little control.
Oh yeah, it was very little control, but I was able to choose the color, which was like great, because obviously this particular shade of blue is a reoccurring motif in my practice, but it relates back to this idea of ghosts and hauntings, and it was created and produced by the Gullah Geechee people that live in the coast of the Carolinas, and who use this as a spiritual marker in their homes. They would paint their ceilings this color, their porches, because they believed that ghosts wouldn't be able to enter into their interior space. So again, this idea of interior space and protecting it and using it in and around queer subjects. So we can keep moving on. Again, just drenching the images in blue and bringing in some more of those sort of iconic religious motifs. But yeah, I want to just go towards the most recent work really quickly, which occurs right after this image, I believe. And so now you sort of see from that recent body of work into what I'm thinking about now, these sort of how I can create a sort of alchemy to either invite these sort of ghosts of our history into the frame, but in a way that feels really material. And so when working on these new images, they were actually shot with damaged and expired film. To think about, initially, there was an accident. I had no clue that it happened. Sometimes in my studio, it happens like that, where, I just pick up some film that I just kind of, and get the work. But it was sort of one of those happy accidents where this expired film really tied into a lot of the ideas that I have been thinking about for so many years, about hauntology, about desire, about mortality and queerness, and the uncertainty of these experiences and living in this body. And by shooting with this expired film really brought all of that to the surface in a way that happened almost like I had been sort of conjuring it all along. And I'm really excited about what I can do moving forward with this new approach to photography. And yeah, this is all very exciting. And so we can just kind of go through them, and me and Chris could talk before time is up.
Okay. Can I ask you, going back a couple of images, there's a not that one. So am I right, and that one too, am I right in seeing echoes, sorry about the dog, of Rotimi Fani-Kayode? Is his work a reference point for you? He's a major figure here in London and becoming more so, I think, rightly.
Yes, he is. Actually, when I was in graduate school, I discovered Rotimi, and particularly his essay, Traces of Ecstasy. And I was in love with the work. And I think as it pertains to ideas around spirituality and queerness and Blackness, Rotimi was one of the first to really address that. And so I'm someone who is working within his lineage, and so many other sort of Black queer artists, from Rotimi to Alvin Baltrop to Lau Ashton Harris to Isaac Julie, Riggs. And so I am happily situated within that canon of Black gay photography, and picking up and borrowing and remixing and sampling a lot of the ideas that they have brought forth for me to be able to reimagine myself and reconstruct myself in this world.
I mean, I thought Rotimi particularly, not only because the images are directly suggestive of, but because, like you said, he's dealing with the sacred and the profane simultaneously. There's no dividing lines in lots of ways. I mean, and that seems like it's your major subject, at least at the moment. There's this sort of combination of religious ecstasy, sexual ecstasy, or dance floor. I mean, you've created, I know, a sculptural space that could be a church, but it could be a kind of sex booth at a nightclub. You're deliberately merging all these kind of points of reference. And I mean, what can you help me understand what you're up to?
You know, I honestly, so I grew up in a house where my bedroom was situated right next to a painting of Jesus. And so whenever I would exit my bedroom, I would see this painting of Jesus, and everything that happened behind the closed doors of my bedroom, I would have to confront immediately after, when I entered the public again. And so I think a huge part of this sort of like new work is me trying to map out this religion in my way, and navigating it in a way that feels safe, feels like it's a space that I could belong to because of the alienation of religion. And I'm saying that I want to carve out this space for other queer people to exist, where our ideas of ecstasy and the sacred and the profane, they are kind of blur. You know, they're blurred. And so, you know, I think for me, it's about just having fun, using my imagination to sort of bring in and conflate a lot of these motifs and symbols into something new, and seeing how people respond to that.
You want to be provocative, I presume.
I think it's always just going to be inherently provocative. I don't think that I like set out to do it intentionally, because I think when I'm doing something that's less provocative, like two heads of a black men caressing one another, you know, I have to deal with an onslaught of anger online. And so queerness in itself is still provocative to people, no matter how much we've progressed as a society. Things like that are just always going to provoke someone, you know. And so I can't really think about that as a goal when I'm in the studio.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then we should carry on. And by the way, everybody else, please post your questions to the Q&A section. We're going to start drawing on your questions too. When you're making work, especially work in this very sensitive, complicated area, who do you think of who your audience is? I mean, who are you making this work for?
I think there's always the assumption that the audience is explicitly going to be the people that you see depicted in the images, which are primarily Black men. But for me, I think there's a specific sort of urgency that occurs within the images that I think Black men, and particularly queer Black men, will immediately relate to. That's just very obvious. But I also think that there's an audience who understands photography and the history of photography and the necessity of me being an artist repossessing the bodies and psyches of Black men within this lineage of photography, because I'm going up against everything that occurred through colonial photography. I'm going up against the lynching photographs of Black men. I'm going up against all of that when I'm in the studio producing and putting something out in the world. And so the audience is the person who is invested in Black gay men or Black men repossessing their image within this medium.
I know you've got some more slides. Do continue.
Oh yeah, sure. Spirit in the Dark. I should also mention that I don't know if the audience is mostly in London, but I do have a show opening on May 14th at Yossi Milo entitled Grace Comes Violently. And so if you are in New York City, please step through. I believe this is the last image. This is the last photograph I made recently. And as you can see, the work has gotten a lot more experimental in nature, and I'm embracing these ideas of glitches and spills and how they're occurring in the photograph. And I know that was something that you were really interested in, Chris, this idea of spills.
I wanted to ask you, what does it mean? And the title of your book, which I don't have it right in front of me, but I know it talks about the spill.
Yes, and so when I was in graduate school, I visited this lake, and this lake was entitled Lake Hope. And I began to start to think about the ways in which blue space, living by blue space, which is just water, could be replicated in my images, because obviously I had been thinking about this psychological landscape of Black manhood and how I could positively impact our emotionality. And the closer you live to water, the better you're off mentally. And so obviously water in itself has this very fraught history in relation to Black bodies. And so for me, the first sort of idea that occurred was the sweat, and realizing how it moved on the surface, kind of like you were spilling. And this spill in itself, I think, is a form of liquid that is malleable, but also cannot be policed. It is doing what it wants to do and existing in a way that it wants to exist in the world. And so I have identified the spill as a way to talk about an embodiment of an erotic, liberated Black queer body. And so Notes Towards Becoming a Spill was a manifesto that I wrote in my graduate studio about this sort of process of becoming and unbecoming. And here we are.
Here's a question from the audience. You mentioned starting out wishing to be a fashion photographer. You've done some magazine covers along the way and so on. Can you imagine integrating these ideas into fashion photography in the future?
I actually really enjoy nodding towards my fine art practice with the fashion photography, whether it's the opportunity to bring in or be selective in who I photograph. I just sort of focusing on Black queer models, or shooting iconic people like Lil Nas X or Samuel Delaney, and also like being able to use my work in fine art to proposition publications to continue to extend or allow me the opportunity to photograph these important Black queer figures. And so that's how I'm able to do it. But I also really love to have fun with fashion. Like that's where I just kind of go crazy, you know? So I really enjoy the times where I can keep them separate.
Can I be very nosy and ask, do you have a commercial agent?
You know, I don't have a commercial agent. I am very lucky to be able to draw in the Times and all these people just by way of the fine artwork. And so it's just really wonderful to have that opportunity.
Somebody else in the audience said it's not a question, but I'm going to turn it into one. She says, your pictures are so touching. It's great work. I can feel so much sadness there. I mean, is that an expressed part of your intention to express sadness and pain? I guess is the extension of that.
You know, I think there is a perception whenever people see these sort of like emotional images of pain or agony. But then there's also these ideas of ecstasy and just like pleasure that exists as well. For me, I'm always trying to show a full range of our humanity, whether it is sadness or if you see presence like tears, that could also be just like an emotional release, you know? Unfortunately, I am a Black gay man. Well, fortunately, but the world that we live in is very violent towards marginalized groups. And so there is always sort of this linger of sadness or yearning for, or longing that exists, whether it's in the photograph or the sculpture. But I think for me, it's very important to show a full range of emotions.
You said in an interview that I read where you were talking about playing Luther Vandross in, I think this is the sculpture that I mentioned earlier, this church-like sculpture, Sermon for Longing in Blue, which as I understand it, without having seen it, the audience can visit inside. And you said, you talk about the way people are able to surrender to their own desires. You talk about the space as a place people could surrender to their own desires while retaining that ecstatic feeling they got in the pews. Actually, I was going to really jump into the music reference. Can you just say a little bit more about your relationship with music and the role that plays in your work? Because I've come across references many times, and it again is a mixture of the kind of sacred and the profane. You've talked about Aretha Franklin, attending to both.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a house that, like I said, was very religious, but also my mother and my grandmother, they didn't go to church, but we played religious music on Sundays that followed like secular R&B music. And it just was never really one way or the other with my family. It was always sort of just this sort of imagined sacred space that we were creating, that I was gaining from the women in my life. And so, yeah, the music is sort of like how I initially start to think about like how I express myself through photographs. Like even like the sadness, that's the person that asked the question. Like when I think about like sadness and how I wanted to, or pain, how I wanted to come across, I'm thinking about like the music of like Mary J. Blige, you know, or, you know, it's just like there's always a reference point to a feeling that I get from music and that I'm trying to create with the photographs. And so like even like blue, the color blue that appears a lot, sonically, blues have been, the blues music was immersed out of like a Black queer culture. You know, in the States, those were Black queer musicians singing the blues here. And so, yeah, there's the sonics of the sculptures are also sort of like happening in the photographs too.
What are you listening to at the moment?
What am I listening to?
Yeah, what's caught your attention recently?
Oh, wow. Okay, so I really love Jasmine Sullivan, Kelsey Lou, who has a song called Shades of Blue that it's on like repeat, but like everyone knows that my favorite singer who I listen to all the time is Brandy. So
no. I've got one last question from the audience. What makes Pittsburgh so great?
Pittsburgh is great because I think there's a tension here in the atmosphere that I can't find in New York, that I can't find in Philly, where I'm from. And the support that they have for artists is overwhelming. That, you know, there's so many artists that have passed through here. You know, I live in an area where down the street I can walk past an entire park where Louise Bourgeois has sculpture up, or Ann Hamilton right around the corner, or Robert Wilson down the street. It's just like I'm surrounded by art by people who I admire, and they've all passed through here. And I'm so glad to be here and have the kind of support that I do from a lot of the organizations here in Pittsburgh. Like I said early on, it's been my kind of Cinderella story. But don't all
saying you're not going to be tempted away by the New York or Los Angeles or even London. Yeah. Okay, good for you. Well, we're a little longer than we said we would be, but Shikeith, do you have anything you want to say to London before you go, or should we just wrap it up there? I mean, come and see us, by the way.
What'd you say?
Please come and see us.
I absolutely have to come to see you all in London. London is one of those places as a kid that I always imagined like visiting, because I was a huge Spice Girl fan. Oh. And one of the reasons why I was teased as a kid. But I love the Spice Girls.
Maybe don't mention that when you're here.
I have to. But yeah, I hope I can do some work over in London really soon. I know that there's people that are already there that support me. I had a solo show at my first solo show. Well, not my first, but I had a solo show there, but I was unable to attend, of course, because of, you know. But yeah, let's do it, London.
Okay, well, see you very soon, and thank you very, very much for today. Thank you, Photo London. Thank you, Aperture, for helping out with this. Go talk about Shikeith at the Aperture booth at Photo London, even though Shikeith is in Pittsburgh. Okay, for this year. Thanks, Shikeith. That was great.
Thank you so much. Have a good one.
Yeah, you too.